Hello and welcome to today's TOC podcast. I'm Joe Weichert, co-chair of O'Reilly's Tools of Change conference. As you've probably noticed by now, the TOC team has been very busy with webcasts and podcasts. Be sure to visit toccon.com for the latest TOC events. And here's another friendly reminder that we're just a few short weeks away from TOC Frankfurt. This year features not only the full-day TOC event on Tuesday, October 11th, but also a half-day social media workshop on Thursday the 13th. For more information or to register, visit toccfrankfurt.com. For today's podcast, I'm joined by Adam Salomone, Associate Publisher at the Harvard Common Press. Adam, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you, Joe. It's good to be part of this. Thank you for having me.
So the cookbooks that you work with at Harvard Common Press, they offer the type of content that's very well suited for more granular presentation in a number of different formats electronically. What do you feel the future holds for this sort of atomic level content?
Sure. I think there's a lot of potential behind the idea of really taking content, especially recipe and lifestyle content, and atomizing it, breaking it down, chunking it. There's so many different words for it at this point that we all know it by a different name. But ultimately, being able to take the recipes out of the books and monetize them in new ways, I think is ultimately important. It's very funny because when we first started thinking about this, I was always thinking about single recipes and selling single recipes, and I've really started to modify that thinking because I think a major issue and a major point of contention for the future of this is going to be the pricing question. You can't really charge 99 cents for a single recipe the way that they're doing at iTunes with their music. You can't even in some cases charge 25 cents, which is a real problem. But can you take that 200 recipe collection, break it down into a 20 or a 10 recipe collection and charge $2 or $1? Incremental revenue that really starts to make sense over the long term. For publishers themselves, I think that the current barriers to entry with this model are sort of twofold, and it's things that we've always come back to. I think it's grounded in technology. I don't think a lot of publishers have their content atomized at this point, and really in a format that makes sense to put it out online in various ways. They don't have systems by which they can be taking apart and recompiling recipes in different sorts of ways as well. And then there's no platform to sell any of it. And no publisher wants to be an island. At least I don't think so. I don't think a consumer's going to want a Harvard Common Press grouping of recipes. They may want to come to a site and take Random House recipes and Houghton Mifflin recipes and Harvard Common Press recipes and put them together and then form their own cookbooks. That's where I think the chunking of content and the atomization really gets to be interesting because consumers now have the ability to decide what they want and how they want it instead of us trying to tell them that that's really what they need to have.
Yeah, and I think you raise a really good point about most publishers not thinking at their content at the atomic level there. So cooking and travel guides, they seem to make a lot of sense. But, do you see a lot of others that could be broken down that way too?
Certainly, and I think it gets back to how deeply you want to get into this. It could work for fiction if we're talking on a chapter level, and sort of what the use cases are. I think for a fiction book, I couldn't see selling an individual chapter, but if we're going to do some marketing or some kind of promotional elements, breaking down and chunking the content on that level really could be sort of interesting and sort of fun. I think it can work in a lot of lifestyle how-to areas, or even reference-y sort of nonfiction stuff. If you think of these big, let's just take like a World War II tome, for example, that you are a World War II buff, but you're only interested in perhaps a certain period of World War II, or a certain general from World War II, or a certain series of battles. If I were that publisher and I could offer you that chapter or that set of articles or whatever it was on a different level, would you be willing to pay more for that than perhaps you would for the entire book because it's more relevant to what you're looking for? So I think it does have applicability.
Yeah, and it reminds me of a sneak peek podcast we did, or webcast, I should say, a month or so ago with Rochelle Grayson from
Sure.
Book Riff. I don't know if you saw that or not, but
didn't.
their whole model is all about breaking the content down into the most atomic level, and not only being able to sell it separately, but also allowing users to create kind of playlists, if you will, which I think that's sort of the missing piece with this, is that it's one thing to have all these pieces out there, but a lot of customers may not know what they want, and if I can share with you something that worked for me, and it's stitched together solution from a number of different sources, all the better, right?
Exactly, and I think it's a great point about Book Riff, because if you think about some of the issues that we were just talking about that are barriers to atomization, Book Riff is really taking care of a lot of that. You upload an entire book and can decide to break it down by chapter or recipe. The consumer can come on and decide how they want to consume it, and you can set a price that really works. So it's sort of the technology and the platform in one really nice, neat package. So I'm really looking forward to the launch of that platform and really starting to test it out and get on board.
Yeah, so Bookriff's one good example that I think is supposed to launch in the next couple of weeks here, and
Hmm.
let's shift and talk about monetization. I mean, they've
Certainly.
got it sort of a piecemeal model. Are there any other models out there that are worth experimenting with, and any that you see that are getting traction?
Sure, certainly. It's a very good question. I think ultimately I'm gonna circle back to and be a little circuitous here, but I think it really is going to be a matter of contracts going forward because I have seen many models that have worked, and I've seen a lot of different things that could be a lot of fun to experiment with. But as publishers, I do want to frame this sort of practically in the ability to work with the author and have the author understand that partnership. But I think licensing is still a very viable model, and I've been surprised actually. Harvard Common Press, we've been approached on a number of occasions in the first half of this year alone by big players in the online world who want to license good recipe content, and it's a matter of, I think, those players realizing the value of curated content and what that brings to the table. One big example is AOL, their Kitchen Daily platform. They're really revving up there, and they really want to license content from a number of different sources. So there's something to be said for that. It's not going to, I don't think it's going to sustain us for years to come, but it's a great way to really fund some of these transition efforts into, the future of the cookbook or the future of the recipe, as that may be. On the other side of the spectrum, I know this is a bit contentious for some people, but I believe in advertising revenue. I believe the biggest barrier to advertising revenue is it's sort of a twofold issue. One is that publishers, I don't think, have the ad sales expertise, but that can sometimes be mitigated through ad sales networks. And I don't think that they're thinking necessarily of monetization outside of the book in the same ways that they're thinking of inside the book. And by that I mean, as a cookbook publisher, if we're constantly feeding recipes onto our website and onto our blog, we're driving traffic to that blog, and that traffic is substantial, why shouldn't we, like everyone else has done, start selling ad space on that website? Publishers, I think, are wary to do that because they believe very strongly in their brand and their place as curators, which I completely agree with, and I completely understand that position. But at the same time, if this can fund other things that ultimately make our content generation techniques better, more advanced, more sustainable over the long term, it's almost our duty as entrepreneurs and as content creators to make that happen so that the burden for pricing is shifted off the consumer, because I think that's the direction we're going in anyway.
Well, I'm so thrilled that you brought up the A word, advertising, because every time I bring it up, the
Sure.
purists climb all over me about, oh no, we can't have advertising in books and so forth.
Hmm.
And I think, I mean, there's a couple things there. One, I feel like with Amazon, they're already kind of taking a step in this direction with this Kindle with special offers, right?
Certainly.
And I think it would be naive of anyone to think that that's not the first step towards a lot more advertising and sponsored
Hmm.
content. And sponsorship is another piece of this that I think folks sort of lose sight of, because
Certainly.
I really feel like it's not like we're saying all of a sudden we can walk away from charging customers for content. We're just going to make it all up with advertising. That's pretty naive too.
Right, right,
But there's
totally.
probably a hybrid approach ahead, I think, with a little bit of sponsorship that allows us to lower the price. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
It's funny because we're actually, as an aside, in the midst of putting together this Future of the Cookbook conference that's going to be taking place in New York, and one of the things that we're thinking about is the sponsorship, and in years past, the holy grail for cookbook publishers was to have some co-edition with a Hamilton Beach or a King Arthur Flower where they buy 100,000 copies and it was non-returnable, and that what is the parallel to that in the online world? I think the idea of sponsored cookbooks or corporate cookbooks or whatever we want to call them, we can't run away from that because I think it's something we've always been doing without really knowing it or thinking about it. It was never a problem to create a co-edition with Hamilton Beach before, but now when you start to think about branding and online and how that can go viral and sort of live on in various ways on social networks, I think publishers have gotten a lot more skittish about that. I'm a huge believer in it. I'm a huge believer in advertising in cookbooks too. One of the parallels I sort of want to draw is to the app world, because I think in the app world something that's very, very common is you have your free version of the app, which is ad supported, and you have your paid version of the app, which has no ads. And why couldn't ebooks be sort of a similar model where now you're selling ad space in your ebooks and then offering those at a either reduced price point or a free price point? I cringe in some ways to think about that, but and then offer the free book or the pay for book with no advertising, and now you are creating a difference in sort of the way that you're presenting the content, such that you're still monetizing it, but you're monetizing it in different ways, and your consumers are defraying the cost to them by giving their attention to these ads. I think challenges are still similar. We don't have those ad sales departments quite yet, but I think there are partnership potentials there. I think we need to figure out the pricing models as well, and that's another thing. Publishers don't, we don't know how to judge a fair CPM rate because you don't know in advance how many cookbooks you're going to sell or how many chapter giveaways you're going to sell. So the advertising piece does get a little sticky, but we have to confront that at some time, or someone else is going to come along and do it. There are all these food sites out there that are already selling advertising and catering to these audiences, and they've been doing quite well thus far.
Yeah, and I keep thinking too that Google sort of revolutionized the way to monetize advertising with search advertising. Certainly. As opposed to just display advertising, and you wonder if there's maybe an opportunity for another paradigm to kind of rise to the surface here within longer form content and so forth. I don't know, but so let's talk for a second now about another area, free.
Sure.
And I mean, you touched on this a minute ago, and one way to kind of leverage it through kind of a freemium approach, give part of it away and then upsell from there. I've often said that search engine results are my biggest competitor, not necessarily another publisher.
Right.
So
totally.
How else can publishers really compete with free?
It's a question that we've grappled with for a very long time, and I think lifestyle publishers, especially, and cookbook publishers, even more specifically, are in a very tough place. You think of Epicurious, you think of All Recipes. They offer up content on a daily basis that is constantly being updated and commented on. I have to really hope that curated content, that content from an author with a brand of some in some ways still resonates with consumers. And by that, the job of publishers for the longest time, when we think about our books, we think of it as sort of an editorial role where we're taking content, shaping it, and then putting it into this book. And it's always been in that editorial role that we feel we've added value. But I would go a step further and say that I think our value is also further exemplified in the fact that we can find those authors, and the fact that you don't have to dig through 1,000 blogs to find them, and then that we can pull out the personality and pull out the narrative for why this recipe is important and why it really resonated with this author, and vis-a-vis that, why it will resonate with consumers. You look at the best blogs online, and they all have stories of some kind. They come from somewhere. They have a pedigree. I would argue that the best recipes and the recipes that people are willing to pay for have a pedigree of some sort and have an author behind them who believes in them, who sort of has taken them with them on this trajectory throughout their life in some personal sort of way, and that does really resonate. The other piece that I think is sort of interesting is the idea of the branding question. And publishers have, when we think of, especially at Harvard Common Press, we think of ourselves, we don't necessarily think of ourselves as a big brand, quote unquote, but do our authors have brands? I would argue yes, they do. And as the barriers for social media come down, as authors get much more savvy about the way in which they use some of this technology, is there a way in which connecting with your audience sort of entices them to pay for something that they might not otherwise, because they're with you and they've sort of followed you down this path, and they feel that personal connection that then really helps to sell the content and sell the book in some ways.
Yeah, and that's the challenge. You talked about brands and values there, and one of the concerns I have is just that through so many of these free products and 99-cent products and so forth, there's a lot of brand cheapening happening right now. Totally. And you got to be really careful.
You do, and I think that it opens up a whole big can of issues in terms of when you think about self-published authors and where they fit into the equation, and the idea of selling an entire cookbook for 99 cents on Amazon. It's expedient, but is it really in the best interest of the industry as a whole as we try and fund future endeavors and future content creation endeavors?
Yeah. So let's talk devices for a minute here, and
Sure.
iPad apps in particular. Everybody's trying to figure out how to create the richest content experience on a tablet, and it just seems to me, I don't know if you're familiar with open air publishing Speakeasy Cocktails, but it's an iPad app that I've been talking about a lot lately. But for every one of those, I've seen like 10 apps that feel like somebody just tried to graft video onto a book. So how should publishers approach that kind of content enrichment so that there's more of the Speakeasy Cocktails and less of the grafted Frankenstein products?
Right. It's a good way to put it. It really gets back to thinking about, we think about our books as products in a way. and many times you start with the print product, and that lends itself to an e-product, and then on and on you go to an app and a website, and it proceeds from there. I think many publishers have gotten into this place where they feel that it's all video, and it's got to be video. It's got to be, because that's what cooking TV shows have done for the longest time, and that's what online videos are doing now. And I would argue that I think the value comes from really thinking about your book and your author on a one-to-one level, on a very specific basis. The most expedient and the cheapest thing would be to templatize it all, farm out the 100 videos to some company and then put those videos in as many books as you can. But when you I think you can begin to think about functionality and what makes sense. As an example, you have a vegetarian cookbook, and it would be really expedient just to put some videos of the author cooking vegetarian food. But why not actually, partner with a company like smartgardener.com, or partner with a company that does a lot of seasonally oriented, vegetable calendars and what's in season now, and get them to stream some of that content into the ebook, and stream some of that information into an app in a way that it can be constantly updated, so that when you're in fall in Boston, you know what to get at your local farmer's market. That has much more lasting impact, I think, than video, because it can be constantly updated, especially when you're thinking about apps. And that kind of constant updating and refreshing of the content is when you start to get into places where you're not feeling that it's been grafted together, or it gets sort of stale or stagnant. It definitely is about what works for your author and what works for your particular books in that sense.
That's a terrific point, because it also reminds me of how so many iPhone apps, for example, don't take into consideration all the various sensors and so forth that are available on the device, right? So they don't fully leverage the device. And talking about video, I think that's everybody's sort of knee-jerk reaction to, okay, that's how I'm going to make my content rich. But like you said, thinking about seasonality and when to push content out and how to adjust and so forth, there's a lot of other things that we can do to make the content smart, without relying on just one particular approach, right?
Right, and I think that's where it gets very, you start to have some of that flexibility when you get beyond just the ebook and get beyond just the idea of the enhanced ebook as, the one form of content. Because once you create that ebook and put it out there, it's out there. And if you're going to issue a new ebook, that's fine. But with an app, you have this flexibility where you can be constantly updating, adding new content, adding, a chapter at a time if you even wanted to go that route, although we're not talking chapters specifically. That kind of thing can really happen in a much more flexible model.
Okay, so pull out your crystal ball for a minute here. Let's talk about file formats, right? So
Sure.
you got Mobi, which is so dominant today because of one platform, the Kindle. But EPUB, and we're seeing this on O'Reilly downloads as well, EPUB has really gained a lot of momentum as well, because all the other device manufacturers are basically supporting it. And then you have HTML5, which a lot of folks would probably say, that's the future. Do you think that there's going to be one dominant format in the future, or are we going to be stuck with all these different flavors?
I would love to. The optimist in me would love to think that we will converge at one point, and the technology will come to a place where we'll have one file format, or we'll have multiple file formats that all you put them all in and they all feed out as one. I think for publishers. How can I put this? The unfortunate thing in some ways is that our retailers have become hardware manufacturers. And those hardware manufacturers sort of live and die by file formats, and in some ways make their living off of the differentiation in file formats as a way to put up these walled gardens. It's that's not to say that different flavors of EPUB are necessarily a bad thing from a piracy perspective, but are Apple and Amazon and Barnes and Noble all going to come together and support one file format among them? I don't know. The pessimist in me now coming out sort of says, no, I don't think they will. And for publishers, the bad news there is that all this innovation and investment we're doing in particular file formats that we believe in today, that may change, and not necessarily tomorrow, but it may change in years from now. So that we're building all this legacy content, but that legacy content may not be the same legacy content we use once we get all the way down the road. But that's not to say that publishers. I think publishers' value is not necessarily in converting their entire backlist to EPUB right now. I think that we all need to do that for purposes of sales and whatnot. But it's in building the expertise so that we can remain flexible about how we go from the initial manuscript at the very beginning to a workflow that allows us to output multiple file formats, whatever they may be. and something I still believe very strongly in is that as content curators and content producers, we've all been getting the EPUB, and we love the EPUB, and it's the great thing right now. But I think we've lost sight of the XML in some senses. And the XML for me is really that skeleton through which all those other file formats can be built off of. And so whether it's EPUB or something different down the road, if you're building your content library so that your XML is there for you when you need it, it's not as much of an issue, I don't think.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And, speaking of different formats and platforms, I was a loyal Kindle user until the iPad came out. Then I jumped on that bandwagon,
Right.
put my Kindle away, and then when I saw the third gen Kindle earlier this year, I just had to have one. So now I've gone back to the point where I'm reading my long form content on Kindle and short form on the iPad. But even Steve Jobs some time ago said that nobody reads anymore, and one of the concerns I have
Right.
is that nobody reads long form content anymore, and it's kind of crazy to say nobody reads at all, but it just seems like it's on a decline. So do you feel like is long form content dying off?
I think it's going to experience a change in the way it's consumed, if I can be diplomatic about my way of putting it out there.
Yeah.
I think that in some ways, consumers are going to come to a place where perhaps as writers we have to get, or as producers we have to get smarter about feeding them content so that the short form content and the long form content are actually the same, but the long form content just gives them more of what they want. And so it's almost like thinking of an executive summary versus a full-on briefing. If you want the executive summary and you want the short form, that's fine and that's great, but you can have more content if you need it. The reason why I don't think long-form content is going to die off completely is because I think that it's all about delivering value, and I think when you deliver something that's relevant to a consumer, they'll keep reading for as long as the content remains relevant to them. The New York Times is a great example. I still love going on in the mornings and sort of reading these long 5, 6, 7-page articles because they feel like they deliver value to me and they give me information that I want. So it doesn't feel like a chore to read them. That's not to say that while I'm reading, TweetDeck doesn't pop up and my attention is temporarily sort of taken away. But that's why I think that the way that we consume content is going to change, but it's not going to change so drastically that long-form content ceases to exist. I think for lifestyle publishers and for cookbook publishers specifically, we're a little bit blessed in some ways because while we publish long-form content in the form of cookbooks, recipes are our short-form content, and so you can go as far or you can go as deep into that as you want, or sort of just skim the surface and read the head notes and look at the indexes. So it gives that flexibility of being both short and long form at the same time that I think resonates with consumers, and they'll continue to appreciate and gravitate towards.
And Kindle singles has been one of the, I think, more interesting, and it's hard to say whether it's successful or not because there's not a whole lot of content there yet, but one of the more interesting short form content experiments out there. But I really feel like Amazon's got it all wrong, and the reason why I say that is they have equated short to mean cheap. Okay, and you just said something that really resonated with me because there's one Kindle single in particular that I've been talking to a lot of people about from Larry Dignan called The New Business of Media, I believe, and I recommend it to everybody. And the reason I do is because Larry did a good job with it, but when I read it in like less than an hour one night, I came away feeling like this felt like a regular business book, but it was condensed down to just the essentials, okay? And I think I paid $3.99 or maybe $4.99. But as I told Larry later, I said, you should have charged $10 for this. You should have actually charged more because you're saving me time.
Right.
And I think there's got to be a little bit of a mix in that in there as well. What do you think?
Interesting. It's a very, very good point. And I like your thought that, it's a convenience factor in some ways because I'm not spending as much time with it, but I'm getting a distillation of everything that I need to know from some of those longer books. As another, to take that a bit further as well, I could imagine a place where you get to the end of that Kindle book and you sort of say, okay, I'm really engaged, I really like it, and there's a want to read more button where you can buy another chapter or something, some supplement to what you've just read that then sort of drives up the cost nominally for you, but allows you to continue. And so now you're taking what was a short form content initiative and really expanding that into a longer form version because you are still engaged and because you want to keep reading. I could certainly see where that would have a lot of appeal with consumers.
Yeah, so I really hope Kindle Singles in particular evolves into something more than it is today. I really think
Certainly.
Amazon's got something good there.
Certainly.
So, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, no, I mean, I think that it really allows consumers to, your point about it sort of being going from shorts to shit, it's a shame that that's the case, but it's such a, it can be such a sandbox for consumers too, because you can really start to dig into things and really get a taste for things in a new sort of way. And this is, I would say this is truer of fiction and sort of, more narrative books than cookbooks specifically, but to get to the middle of a book and realize you're wasting your time is one of the worst feelings, at least in my mind, ever. And so I think some of that short form stuff does bring in an audience that perhaps is more used to short form, but if there's a way to then expand their horizon, expand their thinking to a more long form text, it's better for the publishing industry as a whole.
Yeah, no question. So I'm going to put you on the spot with this final question here.
Yeah.
I look at my own kids, and I look at just younger generation in general, and I worry that they don't have an interest in long form reading so much. I mean, they're still stuck online and with social networks and so forth. Is there any hope today, you think, that the 20 to 30-year-old generation and even younger is going to keep up with long form reading like my generation has?
I'd like to think so. Let me just say that. I constantly sort of hear this I guess we'll call it a soundbite that I appreciate because again, the optimist in me, that electronic books and the movement towards moving more content online is bringing new readers to the table rather than displacing old readers into new formats. I do think that there is a place for the long form content in a very perverse sort of way. I think for publishers, what we've gotten to in this new world of these very quick time cycles in between publications, this new world of self-publishing, really, instead of being true to our mantra of bringing good content to the table that enriches, I think we've really started to just shove all this content down the pipeline in an effort to really compete with everything else we're seeing online and seeing on the blogs and seeing in self-published houses. And I think we're doing a disservice to readers. Do I think that long-form content will survive in this environment where we are deluged with content? Or I don't know. I sort of lean towards the perhaps not, or perhaps not in as robust a way as you and I would hope. Do I think it can survive if publishers really start to do an about-face, come back to their core, realize what they should be sort of thinking about when they publish this content, and really invest in properties that not only capitalize on the new hot thing of the day, but also have lasting power as long form backlist books. There, I think we add value, and I think we add value when we start to become mixed media publishers who realize that grafting video onto a book is not the only way to do it. Who realize that instilling the author's voice and instilling the author's sensibilities into the book as a whole, whether that is in sort of audio back and forth or putting in video podcasts or whatever it happens to be into the book. Then I think you engage consumers in a new sort of way that allows the long form to live on, and that is a future that I do hope we can get to, because ultimately we need to, or else it is going to sort of die away or dwindle, or just be eaten up by other online properties that are doing it fast or cheaply and in a widely distributed way than we are.
Yeah, and I tend to be really pessimistic about it myself. Maybe I should probably take a step back and say that a better approach, or maybe a brighter future, is one where long-form reading evolves, right? So it's not necessarily what we see it as today, but due to the enrichment of some of the content, and maybe even long-form reading becomes sort of a collection of shorter forms kind of stitched together as well. I don't know. But
right. No, it's true. I mean, it's funny because, we can only see as far as our horizon has gone thus far. And, it takes that one person to come along and say, look what I did, for us to be like, oh my God, it's been in front of our eyes all along. I could see something like that for long form. And I think talking today and your idea about the business book that was condensed and then being able to add on to that over time, you get people reading longer form without them sort of realizing it, which is great for the publisher for monetization, but great for the reader as well, because it enriches their reading experience and allows them to continue on an experience that they've found to be something that resonates.
Yeah, and I think just one last point here too, because
Yeah,
as I
sure.
think back on that Kindle single from Larry Dignan, what I really hungered for after I finished it was more, okay, what else can I get from this author on this topic, right? And so
Right.
it's those jumping off points I think we've got to start to be a lot smarter about in publishing. That right now, we might put a back a book ad in, and who sees those half the time? But now
Certainly.
you have a chance to really connect with the reader and point them to something directly.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that's where a lot of interesting potential comes along for content and monetization as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, hey, Adam Salomone, thank you so much for taking the time. Really
Joe,
appreciate you
thank
being
you.
part of this TOC podcast.